Hello, everyone. I'm very happy to welcome you to the first episode of At Work. This is the podcast portion of my series, which is called The Work, Straight Talk on Craft and Method. And The Work looks at histories of today's wellness and performer and artistic training techniques. And in At Work, I'll be focusing on the present in a series of conversations with artists in all disciplines about their relationships to method and craft. And my first guest, who I'm very honored to have today, is Jade Wallace. I'll just provide a little intro and then we'll launch into our conversation, Jade. Jade is a queer writer, editor, and critic, as well as the co-founder of the collaborative writing entity Made. Wallace is the author of two poetry collections with Guernica, Love is a Place, But You Cannot Live There, which came out in 2023, and a forthcoming collection, The Work is Done When We Are Dead, forthcoming in 2026. Made's debut poetry collection, Zoo, will be published by Palimpsest Press in 2025. And I'll add that Jade is a long-standing and much valued member of the Draft Collective before moving on to other important projects. And today we'll be talking about Jade's new novel, Anomia, which came out with Palimpsest Press this spring. And you can see the gorgeous cover as well as my Post-its all through it, which I have to say match the book. That's on purpose.
I see that. I'm impressed.
So welcome, Jade, and congratulations on this wonderful, wonderful book. I'm going to try to ask you actual questions and just instead of just telling you how much I love this book. And
you can do that too.
Being embarrassed, but it's going to be a struggle because I do need to wax very, emphatic about how much I So one of the many things I appreciated most about Anomia was this multi-layered quality that it has. You do so much in a relatively short novel, but it doesn't ever feel like too much. So I'd like to ask you about the genesis of this book. Did you wake up one morning and say, oh, I think I'll write a poetic post-gender, post-human mystery love story travelogue? Or how did these elements come in?
I don't think even to date I have had that thought about the book. No, I am a very slow writer, and it was a long process to get to the book. Many years ago, probably honestly about 10 years ago, I was just starting to try to write fiction, and I had the thought as I was writing a short story, what if I wrote this short story, but you didn't know the genders of any of the characters? And I did that, and the short story was very unsuccessful on just an artistic level. I just didn't quite feel it worked, and journals seemed to agree, and I kind of put it aside, and I was like, I got to come back to that idea, though. It's a good concept. It was just a poor execution. And at first I thought I will try writing more short stories in that vein. And then along the way, for some reason, I just realized I don't actually like writing short stories all that much. Because of how slow I am in conceptualizing things, it takes me like a long time to actually get to the point of even starting to write. And then when you're trying to do, more than one story, it just becomes very easily overwhelming for me. I like a novel where I just have a singular focus point for years at a time. That works for me. And so I had this idea in the back of my head about a novel without gender. And then I was working full time for a long time. And of course, it's very difficult to make time for writing when you are working, 40-hour weeks. And at some point, I was like, I want to go back to grad school. I didn't love grad school the first time around, but it seemed better than working. So I was like, I'd like to go back to grad school, but actually do something I really want to do this time, which is creative writing. And that's going to be a great excuse for me to actually get to the novel and stop putting it off. So that was how the novel started. And over the course of my master's degree, it was, it definitely sped up the process because I didn't really have anything else to preoccupy me. And a lot of my thesis year was like mid-pandemic. And so I didn't even have like things outside to distract myself with. It was just me and the novel and my partner and our dog, who were also here. And the way I create stories of any kind is very much you said layering, and I actually do think of it like that, is in I kind of build a little foundation and there's like there's kind of like a little framework for the story. So in this case, that was the concept of writing a novel without gender. And I was like, okay, and now I need a bit of narrative. And so that was how the sort of the missing persons element of the story came in. I was like, what's the right story to tell where like the absence of gender would be noticeable and important and actually be doing some work and not just incidental. And so I was really drawn to the missing persons narrative, which tends to be very gendered, right? Like if you look at true crime generally, it tends to be extremely gendered in the ways we analyze patterns of violence for completely valid reasons. But I was like, but what if we didn't analyze it that way? Then how would we construe these narratives? And so that seemed like a really productive zone. So I was like, okay, I can add that now. And then I was like, God, I need to make actual characters. And so it everything just very slowly accrued. And like when I wrote the first draft of the novel, it was sparse. It was like a little like 60 handwritten pages, like nothing of a story. I was like, I just got to get some basic plot points down and some characters and have like something to work with. A few of the layers are in place. And I felt like I don't even think of them as like discrete drafts, but I would just slowly over time add to it. I'd be like, you know what? I need to say a bit more about this town. This town needs to be a real setting. I need to fictionalize it a bit. And so like you add some kind of background for the town itself. And then I had someone else look at it at some point and they're like, why don't you lean into the speculative element a bit more? Like, why are you trying to write this as like kind of realism? You don't really seem like you're interested in realism. And I'm like, I'm not. I am going to add some speculative elements to it. And so it was very much just a very gradual collection of ideas. And like you have to make sure they harmonize and whatever. But um, I forget who was posting the other day about it on social media. I feel like it was maybe Carly Baker mentioning starting from a very minimalist position of writing and having to add rather than starting from a very maximalist position and have to take away. And I feel like the people often advocate the latter. They're like, just world build so extensively, more than you ever need, and then pare it back. And that just doesn't work for me at all. I cannot do that. It sounds great, but doesn't work. So I'm very much the opposite of whatever that is. Oh, I think you're muted, Maria.
Well, here we go with our first episode. I can't remember to unmute myself. Yeah, I think that's fascinating that you're talking about building up instead of paring down, because it really is, it's the kind of the done thing is to kind of create this fabric and then cut and shape
Mhm.
on that fabric. And it's good to hear from somebody who doesn't work that way.
Yes, I mean, time will tell whether that's a successful strategy, but it's the only one that really works for me. And I think I would just stop writing novels if I had to do it the opposite way. So I'm just going to run with it.
Certainly successful here.
Thank you.
I don't like reading press releases and cover copy until I
Mm.
so I wasn't actually aware that Anomia was going to be free of references to gender.
Huh, that's interesting.
Call me dense. I was a good way into the book before I realized what was going on. So it's very interesting
Mm.
to hear you say that it was one of the foundational aspects of the book. Um, so I mean, I did eventually realize, but what I did notice first was a striking elegance and economy to the prose. It's not only free of gender, it's also free of most personal pronouns.
Hmm.
Actually makes it sound beautiful. But I'm interested to know more from a process point of view, or what the journey was like writing without gender. And I'm even thinking from a technical point of view,
Hmm.
because you're also a poet as well as a,
Hmm.
not that you necessarily need to distinguish between the two, but the actual wordsmithing of this, is there something that you'd like to say about that?
I have much to say about it. Um, yeah, I'm fascinated. I think you might be one of the only people who read it not knowing what it was going in. And so that is very interesting to me because I have noticed in speaking with other people, most of whom who do have some kind of concept of what they're getting into, um, there are very diverse and distinct responses from people who are like, I just stopped noticing, which is kind of the inverse of what you're describing, where you start noticing. And I think that's kind of beautiful. That's, I guess, in an ideal world, I do want it to be subtle and something you know, that kind of creates a slow and gradual friction as you're reading. Um, that you might have to resolve, but that isn't jarring in any way. Like I didn't want anyone to read it and think, "Oh God, this doesn't sound right. This sounds so unnatural. This sounds so bizarre." Um, and interestingly, though, I have people who take a very opposite tack, and not that they find it jarring per se, but that they very much resist the impulse to just let the story carry on as it is. Like they really do want to gender the character. It's like they treat it more as like a mystery to solve. We have to figure out who these people are, even though the author's refusing to tell us, which is probably the more foreign response to me, but you know, like completely, I think, a valid response, and also even like a predictable one because the novel is set up as a mystery novel. So I mean, I think I kind of seeded that problem. It's not that that's a problem, but I seeded that outcome for myself. Um, but yeah, endlessly fascinating to see how other people read it because, of course, I have ways I read it, and those certainly need not be the ways other people approach it. But yeah, I mean, because it's a constraint-based novel, there was, of course, a challenge in language in constructing sentences where you're avoiding gendered pronouns being the most significant one, but then also sometimes the ways you're trying to refer to people. Like I would say probably one of the most difficult parts of the book, which I still don't really feel like I resolved, was one of the characters, Lim, has a single parent. And so the parent gets referred to as the parent because you can't use mother or father or whatever. And I probably could have given the parent a name and the kid, because the kid's a teenager, the kid Lim could have just called the parent by parent's name. But I was like, I feel like parenthood is a really interesting zone to think of as being divorced from gender. Like I wanted people to really read a parent character and them to clearly be a parent, not just seeming like this older person who happens to be there. Like to be clearly a parent, but then having to negotiate this issue of, well, you don't know, are they a single mother? Are they a single father? Are they, they non-binary? You have no idea. And how do you interpret them and their actions and their relationship with their child in that context? But the other issue with the language, besides the constraint, which definitely took some finagling, but mostly it wasn't really as hard as I expected to just avoid gendered pronouns. I mean, there are lots of ways of conveying relationality and possession, like when it comes to objects and things, without necessarily using those pronouns. I mean, pronouns are like a shorthand, basically, right? Like, so there are lots of other ways to construct a sentence without necessarily relying on them. But then the other consideration was, of course, as you mentioned, I write poetry, and I actually, if I had to pick, but vastly prefer writing poetry just as a stylistic choice, even though in the end, I tend to be very sad. Like when I write fiction, I tend to be very satisfied with it if I feel it was successful. It feels like a huge accomplishment. Like, not that it doesn't feel like an accomplishment when I finish a book of poetry, but it's a much more limited, narrow kind of reality, I feel. The fictional reality is so dense. And I find creating a fictional world, there's like a certain kind of satisfaction in it that I just can't really get from poetry. So I do appreciate that about it, but like on the level of having to write sentence after sentence after sentence and fill a page and not just have line breaks everywhere, I do find that tedious sometimes. And so I have a tendency to treat it as if it's poetry, and I refuse to write extraneous words that aren't doing something. And I refuse to use words that don't feel like they quite fit or that are an approximation. Like I feel like you can get away with a lot of kind of approximation in prose. You can like, there's a lot more tolerance for throwing out cliche phrases or idiomatic expressions or whatever. And we just kind of let it ride because you get into the flow of the story and you realize the person's trying to tell the story. And for better or worse, I can't bring myself to do that. So I sit there and I treat every line like it's a line of a poem, and it has to be very distinct and purposive, and it has to have a certain rhythm to it, the way poetry would have rhythm to it. Which sounds like it's more tedious, but for me, it actually keeps my attention on the page instead of like drifting off and wanting to do other things. So that is why it sounds the way it sounds, mostly because I'm writing it. I'm like just barely pushing it past the realm of poetry into prose a lot of the time.
It really does read like poetry. Yeah, it's very, very beautiful. And I think when I first started reading it, I think I was just so caught up in that, and that was very much carrying forward, and I was just not caring so much about, you know, the gender or anything like that. But a- as I got into realizing, I like what you say, the constraint that you had created
Mm-hmm.
for I did start to reflect on, what is this constraint doing for me,
Mm-hmm.
to me as a reader? And I found it acted as a kind of a defamiliarizing device
Mm-hmm.
that forced me to look at my own assumptions, especially
Mm-hmm.
if you've got themes of love and violence there. So I was thinking, am I gendering this character
Mm-hmm.
male because there's the possibility or the threat of violence there, or is the more the character who wants connection more, am I gendering this character female, and so on.
Mm-hmm.
But that kind of dropped away,
Mm-hmm.
and long I was thinking, I was finding other aspects of the characters that became more vivid in the sense of the kind of habitual gendering, I think. Like,
Mm-hmm.
kind of freshened up my
Yeah.
the characters. Um, and one of the things that came to the fore was the age of the characters and
Mm-hmm.
the tensions that seem to arise between the generations.
Yeah.
So maybe you can talk about the
Mm-hmm.
multi-generational aspect of the
Yeah.
book.
Absolutely. I mean, I think it's the process you're describing of reading and, having a sort of impulse to make assumptions about people that follow a more sort of conventionally gendered mode, and then having to sort of put those aside is really like very validating in a way to hear, because part of the thing I was thinking of as I was writing the characters was literally like, okay, for whatever the next thing is that they're going to do, like what did they just do in the last scene? How can I write into or away from a gendered assumption? And like sometimes, like I went both ways. Sometimes I'd, write a scene where it's like, maybe this character is playing into gendered assumptions or leading you down a particular path of assumptions a bit. And then it's like later in the story, I needed to really reroute and be like, no, no, but like that's not how I'm going to write the character on the whole. So what can I do to actually lead you now away from that? And so you are, like you said, defamiliarized, but also like unsettled a little bit. Like you can't actually, not you can't, I'm sure someone can, but purposely making it difficult to like put someone in any kind of stereotypical gender box. Um, while at the same time kind of goading you towards that at times, having these little like red herrings that make you maybe want to gender someone in a certain way in a particular scene, but then underwriting that later, undercutting that later. Um, but then the issue of age, I mean, I am, I don't know to what extent this is completely fair thing to say. I feel like we live in a very youth preoccupied literary scene a lot of the time. People are very interested in who is emerging and who is under 35 and emerging and who is the voice of their upcoming generation and all this stuff that's like, important on some level. But I really hate it on the whole. And I'm much more interested in a kind of intergenerational experience in general, like in literature, in the stories we tell, because I think our lives are very intergenerational and multi-generational. And I really chafe against the preoccupation with youth and its association with certain like literary scenes and things. Which is not, of course, to say there are lots of older established writers, obviously, but there's there are assumptions. It's like you can be young and emerging, you can be old and established, and it's very hard to be anything other than those kind of things. And this was, I mean, important to this novel in particular, I suppose, because like you said, I like just because the character is not gendered does not mean they don't have identities. They still need to be located in the world in certain ways. So one of the things I did, obviously, I gave them ages. I wanted to have kind of a spread of ages and have the story bring them all together, even though they're very much generationally separated at the beginning. Like Slip is older and is living alone. The two teenagers obviously spend a lot of time hanging out together. The two middle-aged people, they're friends, and so you see them a lot together. But I really wanted them to intermix more and more as the novel sort of goes on. And age became one of the ways to sort of distinguish them that was apart from gender. Occasionally, I would give them like particular physical traits, like Mal, I mentioned a few times, has this very springy, curly hair. Bear has these green eyes, et cetera, et cetera. But not in a way. I'm trying to avoid anything that would like give you a clue or make you try to, guess about any gendered implications. Just then, but then for them to still have physical traits and physical realities, whether it's an aging body, whether it's, a height differential between them and other people. Like there are lots of ways of describing people and relating them to each other that don't rely on gender. And so I did have to definitely play up those elements of the characters, and age is a bit of a pet subject for me. So I think that one ended up coming to the fore.
That's actually such a great comment, and it brings to mind for me the characters don't always act according to their age type. Because Slip, for instance,
Mm-hmm.
is such a central character,
Mm-hmm.
has achy bones and has this past and so on. And
Mm-hmm.
we know that Slip is located in time, but
Mm-hmm.
Slip surprises us
Mm-hmm.
of times. And is kind of this idea that a person who's more elderly might not have so many surprises left in them or
Mm-hmm.
so much possibility for personal,
Mm-hmm.
and that process does happen with Slip. So in a way, I think you push, and bringing them together too, I think you do manage to stretch your readers a little bit there too, in terms of assumptions
Mm-hmm.
around age, although you locate people maybe by pairing them is a
There are a lot of pairs, yes.
yeah, which takes me to my next question.
Okay.
I was trying to picture this book as a film because
Mm.
I was asking myself, so when I didn't think about gender, what was I seeing in my head?
Yes. Yes.
And I think I saw it as an animated film at first,
Mm.
where the characters might the character's gender might not be clear or might not be
Mm-hmm.
um but then I sort of shaded into like a Wes Anderson meets Peter Greenaway with
Mm-hmm.
hanging around with these pairs and the occasional one person coming in or one leaving.
I can see that, yes.
And then I was kind of seeing that formalized almost the groupings of people in almost
Mm.
a dance.
Mm-hmm.
You,
Mm-hmm.
you might have a pair and then a third comes in and one leaves. Anyway,
Mm-hmm.
this is going on and on about my experience, but I'm
Mm.
interested to know. I'd love to know your literary influences, but I'd also like to know if there are influences outside of literature, maybe in the other arts, maybe
Mm.
elsewhere, maybe in nature, um, that you carried with you or that came in as you wrote.
I always find that, I mean, I suppose I have a few thoughts on that. So yes, the characters are definitely paired, and in part that was very intentional because isn't that the quintessential like heteronormative assumption? You're going to have pairs, there's going to be a man, there's going to be a woman often, or they're going to be two teenage friends, so clearly they'll be of the same gender or whatever it is. Like, I feel like pairing people up is a surefire way to get people to start thinking about gender. So I did that a little bit on purpose. But yeah, and then of course, all of their social groups very much start to intermix as the novel progresses, and it really undermines any of the. No, it doesn't undermine the pairings. I mean, the pairings are still significant. They're still significant relationships, but um, we do see a lot more fluidity as the novel goes on in terms of how the characters are relating to each other. As for the influences, though, I mean, this is both a very easy question, a very hard question. So it was very easy to say what are like the top 5 books that influence this novel, because they are literally the ones I picked and read so that I could write a critical essay on my own novel for my thesis. So those are, I have them sitting around somewhere. Do I have them right here so I can show them to you? Yes, I might. And then, so these are the 5. Well, I'll start with the most obvious and direct sort of ancestor of Anomia, which I actually had never heard about until after I had the idea for a genderless novel, but that's Anne Garrett's Sphinx, originally written in French, and then it's been translated here by Emma Ramadan and put out by Deep Vellum. And it was sort of the original novel, I think, that represented characters without gender. It was a bit more of a limited experiment. It was just the 2 main characters who are a pair of lovers. But she was definitely sort of playing around with, well, not just playing around. She was definitely working with that constraint. And so I read it, of course, with great interest. And she was also a member of Oulipo. She was at the time when she was inducted, or however they say it. She was like, I think, the youngest ever member who became part of the Oulipo group. And so she is very obviously interested in experimentalism and constraint and things like that as well. So I had read it before I actually started writing the novel, and I was like, this is amazing. It was written in the 80s, so it was very ahead of its time in a lot of ways, although also very not ahead of its time in certain ways, but I think that's a little bit beside our current point. But I read it and I was like, this is so cool in terms of thinking about being able to represent individual characters without gender. And I was like, but what would it mean to create a larger world and a society without gender? And like, how would the society function? How would characters interact with social systems if you didn't have that sort of like jumping off point to interpret them from? And so I was like, this is an amazing book, but I feel like there's space for me to take this concept further than it was taken here. And then the next book was actually written later, but probably more famous, is Jeanette Winterson's Written on the Body. This edition was put out by Vintage, and she was writing in the 90s, and the novel's very noteworthy in that the main character is never gendered. The main character is obviously some variety of queer or bisexual, or it's not really specified, but the person has lovers they talk about who are of various genders, but we never actually find out the main character's gender. And not to say Jeanette Winterson was doing it on easy mode, because that sounds very impolite, but like, she writes in first person, right? So she avoids this problem of gendered pronouns, and she certainly avoids the problem of like social structures around gender norms and things like that, in ways that, for example, even Anne Garrett, I think, gets a little bit more into. But it's like such a beautiful, poetic book. I think it has a very lyrical kind of approach to language as well, and is, maybe not always concerned with reading like prose. And so I really love that about the book. And so that was the other way it really influenced me. And then earlier than either of those actually was, but maybe a little bit less influential in the book, was Monique Wittig's The Apophanax, where she was playing around with ways of representing this small girl, child, the lines are a little bit blurred sometimes, character. But the child is very clearly like treated as a girl, is like in a kind of girls' school. Um, and regrettably, my French is not good enough to read the original. So I'm, of course, reading a translation here. This one is a translation by Helen Weaver and put out by Daughters Inc. But she was, one of the things I gleaned from reading an essay on it was that she was playing around with this interesting pronoun in French, which is on, O-N, which is often used as a kind of gender neutral pronoun, of course. But, like kind of similar to the way we would use they or even one. But it's French, so it's not a perfect continuum there, of course. But anyways, yeah. So she was definitely sort of experimenting, but like within the context more of a second wave feminism type thing. So you never see her like completely shuck off gender and sex. They are still there, but she's really complicating our readings of them in some very interesting ways. And then much more currently, there was Akweke Emezi's The Death of Vivek Oji. And I feel like I can't really describe it in too much detail without spoiling it for anyone who has not read it. But in short, it follows this trans character, and Emezi does very interesting things with pronouns over the course of the novel. And you actually see the use of pronouns and the use of ways of talking about the character shift as the character changes. So that was just to me a really interesting. Obviously, it's not the same approach I'm using since I'm eschewing pronouns, but it was really interesting to read and think about like the different ways we can play with pronouns in literature and how we don't have to always ascribe to extremely rigid rules around them, but there might be like new ways of thinking about how we use them. And somewhat similarly, Joshua Whitehead's Johnny Appleseed, which, I forgot to mention, Akweke Emezi, this was put out by Riverhead Books. And then Johnny Appleseed was put out by Arsenal Pulp Press. And again, it's not really a book eschewing pronouns or anything like that, but what it is doing is really complicating our read of the main character via the types of noun, like particularly the nouns and adjectives that Whitehead's using to describe the main character, who is two-spirit, who's like does not have a conventional experience either of gender or sexual orientation. By conventional, I mean like, this sort of like very Western binaristic idea of gender. But yeah, so it was a different way where the focus is not really on pronouns, but on other language we use to talk about and describe a main character. And it's written in the first person, so it's really the way the character is describing himself. But yeah, just lots of interesting like reflections on ways to represent characters in literature and like how we can do that in ways that don't shoehorn them into particular normative gender assumptions. So those were the 5 books. Other influences, I always find this such a hard question because absent me making a list for myself of the things I'm going to read in advance to influence me, I find it very difficult. I can say shortly before I wrote the book, I was reading a lot of like 19th century Gothic writing for one of my classes. And I feel like that those sort of Gothic sensibilities really did creep in certain ways to the novel. They were not at the fore, perhaps, but I do feel like there's a bit of definitely some like morbid tendencies in the book. There's some flares of melodrama, I feel at times, like particularly in the way the characters express themselves. And as for other, I find that a very difficult question to think about other mediums entirely, because obviously I'm engaging with them. I listen to a lot of true crime podcasts, for example, which I guess inadvertently asserted themselves into the novel, even if it was just so I could write against them. I guess I'd have to say that was a big influence. As you can probably tell from the way I phrase that, I have very mixed feelings is not even a strong enough word. I have a lot of issues with true crime as a genre, as I think we probably all should. Not to be too moralizing about it, but at the same time, it's such a crucial touch point for us to talk about social violence. So like even if the ways we do it are not always the most even if we can't always agree on the ways to talk about it, I do think the conversations it is trying to have about violence and the causes of it and the reverberations of it, like I think those are important conversations, whatever qualms we might have about the way the genre goes about addressing them. Yeah, I feel like that's the extent to which I can answer the question. Oh, films though. I was going to say about films. I mean, I find the film question so fascinating because I watch a lot of film and yet I feel very much removed from it in a lot of ways. Like my partner, I sometimes talk and he's like, I wish I could work in film. If I could pick working in film as opposed to being a writer, I would do that. And I was like, oh, I absolutely wouldn't. Like I feel a very clear affinity for writing that I just don't feel for film, even though I watch it several times a week. And then, but inevitably, like, you're surrounded by it. And so you think about it. And I'm like, I don't even know. I don't know. I truly don't know if Anomia could even be represented in film. It feels very much like foremost a literary experiment because it is so obsessed with language, because part of the way it functions is it's evasive about the way things or people look. And film can't be. And so film would have to come up with these total other strategies to represent the narrative. And I'm clueless, so I have no idea how it would do that. And I think one of the things I always think of when I'm considering Anomia in relation to film is something, forget who it was. Someone read Anomia and they said, I felt like I was walking around a world without my glasses on. Like I could see people, but only kind of their dim outline, their fuzzy kind of outlines. And I was like, I mean, that's kind of how I see them as I'm writing, frankly, which like I have terrible distance vision. And so that is often how I see people anyway. So I guess it feels very intuitive to me in a way, but very antithetical probably to film. I don't generally think people enjoy blurred shapes too much in character driven films. But I could be wrong.
Thanks for that. Actually, that's really I like the idea of the blurred the blurred vision.
Mm-hmm.
That's one of your influences.
Yes, unknowingly until someone else pointed out. And I was like, that probably is. It's just seeped into my consciousness because it's part of my physical reality.
I used the word post-humanist earlier, and I don't
Mm.
really mean I was looking for a word that
No, I
kind
totally know what you mean.
um the flora and fauna have an
Mm-hmm.
extremely important role in this to the point
Yeah.
where there are characters. And I thought it was beautiful the way you took sort of you were maybe you talk about it as constraint based, but it's really expanding the idea of
Mm.
gender.
Mm-hmm.
Then you go even beyond the idea of the human being as the subject or
Mm-hmm.
yeah. So can you say something about your relationship to nature
Yeah.
and where nature lands in this book?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the term the term is interesting. I knew immediately what you meant when you said post-humanist, and I kind of do feel that way. I mean, I think for me, the term I most often go to, even though I don't really like it because it's a negation, but back long ago, I did an MA in social justice and equity studies, and one of my interest areas that I did some papers on was anti-speciesism, which, as you can imagine, philosophically and ethically is a hugely contentious kind of territory for a myriad reasons. But one thing that always did sort of stick with me that I think has just become part of my like core ethical philosophy as a person is I don't actually have any sense of human beings as having some kind of supreme importance in the universe to the exclusion of other animals. I mean, humans are animals. Like we're glorified animals in some ways, but we're all animals. We all like I look at, you know, our dog and I'm like, she doesn't have the same language I do, but she has a lot of the same cognition and feeling and self-interest and social relationships. And like I cannot look at her and think, oh no, I am a more worthy type of creature than she is to exist. I just don't. And increasingly, um, ever since we got a house a number of years ago, well, 5 years ago now, and I got into gardening all of a sudden, and I became very fascinated with all the plants in the yard. And I was like, I even feel weird now, kind of like digging up plants and like, you know, taking things from a greenhouse and moving them. And it all feels very controlling in a way I don't entirely like sometimes. Um, and I started to have this relationship with plants as well, where I was like, yeah, they're also living organisms. Like they got their own things going on. They want to survive. There's been studies done showing they respond to stimuli in their environments, and trees sometimes will share nutrients with each other, so they have a kind of like communal interdependence. And like, I just cannot maintain the illusion that humans are somehow better than all other forms of life on Earth. And so when I was writing Anomia, I was like, well, I can't pretend that like other things in the environment are not going to interact with these characters and the narrative. Like they don't really have a central place in the narrative because a lot of the problems that the novel is interested in are very much human problems, but there are nevertheless animals that, this is an early chapter, so I'm not giving anything away to say that at some point there are bones in the woods and like a coyote comes across the bones. And that seems completely natural to me. Of course, a coyote would come across the bones at some point and interact with them. And why should that be excluded from the novel's purview? It's as valid an encounter with the bones as Flip coming across them in the woods. Um, and I did struggle with that a bit because I'm like, I don't want to write this like really sentimental Charlotte's Web-ish anthropomorphic, view of animals and plants. I'm like, how could they exist in the narrative in a way where like they are being recognized without placing too many assumptions on them? Um, so I have no idea whether that succeeded, but that's what I was definitely trying to do. And it's not like a main concern of the novel, but it definitely does come up a few times. Like it's a bit of a thematic motif, I guess. Um, and at some point I was like, should I cut these out? Is it too beside the point? And I was like, I don't think it is. I mean, I think our 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 assumptions about gender are very much tied into our assumptions about what makes us human and how we identify ourselves. And I don't really think you can completely separate those out. I left it in.
I think, yeah, oh yeah. And not only the animals, but also the plant life and
Hmm.
mycelial life and things like
Yes.
that make their appearance. And to me, it just spoke to kind of variety. Like
Hmm.
there's so much beyond gender,
Yeah.
even people,
Hmm.
like
Yep.
how those creatures and those entities uh, go about differentiating themselves or whatever. Yeah, if
Yeah.
they need, if indeed they do differentiate.
Hmm.
And so yeah, I thought it was such a powerful aspect of the book. And I think it got me out of whatever potential melodrama might have
Hmm.
been between, because it's like love, loss, lost person
Hmm.
kind of story, and people are very heartfelt, but I think it might
Yeah.
have felt like melodrama had you not kind of
Hmm.
pulled back, and it's like, wait a minute, those people are so small in
Yes.
the larger,
Hmm.
the woods and
Hmm.
and
That's
even what is life, right?
Yeah. Well, it's interesting you mentioned that because that was not necessarily a thought I had writing the novel, but it's a thought I have often about people, like including myself. Like when I feel I'm being melodramatic, I often look around and I'm like, there's like this tiny little piece of dust in the universe. Like relax. Um, but yeah, so it's interesting that you read that into it, even though that's probably only motivating me subconsciously. Like I was never consciously putting that thought into the novel, but it's absolutely part of my worldview.
Dust in the wind,
Hmm.
day, all we are.
Yeah.
And I just want to ask you one final question, Jade.
Hmm.
But we could keep going and talking about this book for a very long time. But in a book that kind of deals with the limits of language, I found myself consulting the dictionary a fair amount for words like autostereogram, crypsis, colliginous. Um, there's lots of $1 million words in there. Are you a word collector, or do you keep lists? How do you work in those wonderful words, or did it just arise around the wonderful words? Tell me more about
Well,
words.
you have clearly saved my favorite question for last. It is a combination of things. I'm absolutely a word collector. Like my dictionary is stuffed with these pages where I've written down words that weren't in the dictionary, but I found them somewhere and I want to have them in a central space. So I put them on a sheet and I stuff them in the dictionary and I've expanded the dictionary. Um, it's a bit of an old dictionary, so it is genuinely missing some words. But yeah, I love to collect words. I love a good, it's funny. I often hear them called $10 words. $1 million words is like really upping the ante. So I love a $10 word and a $1 million word for sure. I often have to restrain myself from using them a little bit because I'm like, okay, it's fine to have a certain number of words per page that people aren't likely to know, but also like they should not have to consult the dictionary every single sentence. So maybe tone it down a bit. Um, but like for me, it's part of, which is not at all to say I feel the book is like dumbed down in any way. I just feel like even when I'm reading a book, there's a certain amount of novelty I want to encounter and a certain amount of familiarity. Like I need a palatable amount of novelty so that I can appreciate the page. Maybe later I'll look up a word or two I didn't know on it, but I'm not just sitting there going, what the fuck is happening? So, the delicate balance of writing at all times for all of us. Which is not just about vocabulary. It can also be about things like how much context do I provide and how much explanation versus how much do I trust the reader to intuit things. And like all these questions we have to ask ourselves as writers to ensure that we're communicating what we want to communicate effectively. But in terms of the language in this book, to be honest, apart from my little dictionary collection, I am constantly horrified by the number of words I personally do not know. And so I had to do so much research for this book. I'm like, I don't know what the names of plants or architectural styles or whatever it is. I'm like, I lack so many words. I'll have an idea in my head, I'll have an image, I'll have a concept. And I'm like, I know what I want to say. There's got to be a word for that. And then I have to go dig for it because I have no idea. Like, there's, yeah, so much I do not know about the world. But you are writing your story and you're like, I feel this is important to express and include, and you got to go figure out what the right word or set of words is to actually get it across. And I think that's for me one of the most delightful parts of kind of puzzle building that happens when you're writing. Like puzzle solving and puzzle building at the same time. It's like you're solving one puzzle to build another for the reader in some ways. Um, yeah, so sadly, sometimes I look back at my book and I'm like, what the fuck does that word mean? I don't even remember. Now I have to go look it up. And then I look it up, I'm like, oh yeah, that was the perfect word. I'm glad I found that one. But I also forget them sometimes after.
Well, thank you so much, Jade, for this wonderful conversation, for this wonderful book. And yeah, I understand it's being very well taken up, but I hope everybody reads it. I think I just think it's a great book, and I so enjoyed preparing to talk to you because I got to go think about it even more and look through it and pour through it even more. So, is there anything you want to add before we finish off and finish off the recording?
I don't think so. I mean, apart from saying thank you so much for reading, you're always a wonderfully attentive reader and an excellent conversationalist. And so it's an absolute pleasure to talk to you. And I'm always honored by any of the time and attention that you give to my work.
Thank you, Jade. Bye for now, everybody out in Workland.